The dining hall sparkled under the soft glow of chandeliers, casting a warm light over the city's elite, mingling and exchanging pleasantries. Dr. Stephen Hart stood at the edge of the crowd, a glass of wine in hand, surveying the room. Tonight's charity event, hosted at one of the most prestigious restaurants in the metropolis, was more than just a gathering of the wealthy. It was a showcase of influence, power, and reputation. It was the kind of place where connections were made and secrets were exchanged with smile. Stephen felt a familiar tension rising within him, though tonight it had little to do with the patients he usually treated. He was surrounded by fellow doctors, politicians, and celebrities, all smiling and laughing, but his mind was elsewhere. His wife, Maya, stood a few feet away, chatting with the mayor's wife, her expression animated. She had the ability to charm a room effortlessly. But even as Stephen admired her from afar, he felt a deep unease. His unease was interrupted by a commotion at the head table, where Governor Randall was holding court, surrounded by his closest associates. The governor, a man known for his ruthless political prowess, suddenly slumped forward, clutching his chest. Gasps erupted from the surrounding guests as chaos quickly followed. Stephen's instincts kicked in, and without thinking, he rushed toward the governor. Randall's face had turned a sickly pale color, his breathing labored. Kneeling beside him, Stephen pressed 2 fingers to Randall's neck, feeling for a pulse. It was faint. A wave of dread washed over Stephen as he looked down at the man in front of him. The governor's heart was failing. This was more than a typical heart attack. It was the culmination of years of untreated cardiac issues. And Stephen knew that he had been involved in those issues, albeit indirectly, years ago. He had failed this man once before. Forcing his thoughts aside, Stephen barked orders to the nearby staff, directing them to call for an ambulance. His hands moved with precision, performing emergency care to stabilize Randall. But as he worked, a familiar chill crept up his spine, the weight of his past failure threatening to overtake him. The ambulance arrived, and Stephen handed over Randall's care to the paramedics, his heart pounding. The room around him had fallen into a hushed murmur, and the glances thrown his way made it clear. The entire city would know soon enough what had happened here tonight. And Stephen feared what might follow. Stephen sat in the back of the ambulance, watching the paramedics work on Randall, his mind racing. He knew the hospital staff would be expecting him to take over once they arrived, but he couldn't shake the overwhelming dread that consumed him. As the ambulance sped toward the hospital, memories from years before began to surface. He had seen Randall's medical files long ago, files that showed the clear signs of cardiac issues that should have been treated more aggressively. But at the time, Stephen had been young, eager to climb the ranks in the medical world. He had signed off on a less invasive treatment plan for Randall, one influenced by political pressure and promises of connections. That decision, a quiet nod to the system's corrupt underbelly, had haunted him ever since. Now, here he was years later, in the back of an ambulance with the same man whose life he had silently endangered. Sweat dripped down his neck as he thought about the consequences if the truth ever came to light. How many lives had been affected by his choice? How much more could he lose? Arriving at the hospital, Stephen quickly fell into his professional role, directing the medical team to stabilize Randall. But every movement fell heavy, as if his hands carried the weight of his past mistake. Randall was whisked away to the operating room, but Stephen could hardly focus on the present. Dr. Erin Graves, one of his colleagues, entered the room, her expression sharp as always. "Looks like you had quite the night," she remarked, glancing at Stephen with curiosity. There was something in her eyes that unnerved him, a glint of suspicion he couldn't quite place. "Just another day in the life," Stephen muttered, attempting to mask his discomfort. But Erin's gaze lingered a little too long, as if she sensed that there was more to the story. The night passed slowly, filled with routine updates on Randall's condition. As dawn approached, Stephen found himself alone in his office, staring blankly at the files on his desk. He had spent his entire career building a reputation as one of the city's top cardiologists, but the foundations of that career were built on a lie. And now, with Randall's life hanging in the balance, Stephen knew it was only a matter of time before the truth began to surface. The hospital was buzzing with activity, but Dr. Stephen Hart moved through the corridors in a daze. Governor Randall's condition remained critical, but stable for now. Though the immediate crisis had passed, Stephen couldn't shake the sense of impending doom. The weight of his past mistake bore down on him like never before, especially with Dr. Erin Graves hovering around the case. She had always been a sharp, observant doctor, too observant for Stephen's comfort. As they passed each other in the halls, her knowing glances seemed to pierce through him, as if she could sense the guilt he was hiding. After a long shift, Stephen sat in the doctor's lounge, staring at the coffee cup in his hands. He couldn't concentrate, not with Erin's suspicions lingering in the air. He had been careful all these years, keeping his secret buried. But now, with Randall in such a vulnerable state, he feared that any misstep could unravel everything. Erin entered the lounge, breaking Stephen's train of thought. "Stephen, how's Randall doing?" she asked, her tone casual, but her eyes probing. "He's stable for now." "It was a close call," Stephen replied, trying to keep his voice steady. "Good work as always," Erin said, though there was a hint of something else beneath the compliment. She paused before continuing. "You seemed different tonight, like something was bothering you." Stephen stiffened, trying to brush off her comment. "Just the usual stress. High-profile patients, you know how it is." Erin nodded, but her eyes didn't leave his. "Of course, but feels like there's more to it. I've been in this field long enough to know when something's off." Stephen swallowed hard, his heart pounding. He could feel her suspicion growing, the questions forming in her mind. She was too smart to let things go, and he knew that if she dug deeper, she might uncover the truth about his involvement with Randall's case years ago. He needed to find a way to steer her suspicions away from him, but Erin wasn't the only problem he faced. Back at home, Maya had been consumed by her own work, investigating political corruption that was making waves in the city. She had been distant lately, and Stephen knew it was only a matter of time before her research led her dangerously close to his secret. The next morning, Stephen stood in the ICU, staring at Governor Randall through the glass. Machines hummed and beeped around the unconscious man, keeping him alive while his body fought to recover. Stephen's mind was still reeling from his conversation with Erin the night before. He couldn't let her dig deeper. His entire career, his marriage, everything was at stake. As Stephen reviewed Randall's charts, a nurse approached him with an update. "Dr. Hart, the governor's condition is stable for now, but we're still monitoring for any signs of deterioration." Stephen nodded, barely hearing her. His thoughts were clouded with memories of the choices he made years ago. The choice to overlook Randall's growing heart problems in favor of a less aggressive treatment. He had allowed himself to be swayed by Randall's political influence, agreeing to a plan that kept the governor out of the hospital and away from public scrutiny. The memory of that decision gnawed at him now, especially with Erin's eyes on him. He couldn't shake the feeling that she was watching his every move, waiting for him to slip up. But what terrified him more was the possibility that Maya, in her investigation, might stumble across the very corruption that had led to his poor decision all those years ago. At home, things weren't much better. Maya had been spending more time away from him, engrossed in her work. She had uncovered a trail of evidence linking Governor Randall to several shady deals with a major pharmaceutical company. Stephen knew she was on to something big, but the deeper she dug, the closer she would get to his own involvement. That evening, as they sat down for dinner, the tension was palpable. Maya was distant, her thoughts clearly elsewhere. Stephen tried to engage her in conversation, but her answers were short, distracted. Finally, unable to stand the silence, he asked, "Maya, what's been going on? You've been so focused on work lately. Is everything okay?" Maya looked up from her plate, her eyes narrowing slightly. "I've just been busy. This story I'm working on, it's huge, Stephen. It's bigger than anything I've ever done before." Stephen's stomach clenched. "What kind of story?" Maya hesitated, then said, "I can't get into the details yet, but let's just say it involves some very powerful people, including Governor Randall." Stephen's heart skipped a beat. He knew what was coming next. I've been digging into his political connections, and there's something shady going on with a pharmaceutical company that's tied to a lot of big names in this city, Maya continued. And I'm getting closer to the truth. Stephen felt a cold sweat form on the back of his neck. If Maya kept going down this path, she would eventually uncover his role in Randall's health decisions, and that would be the end of everything he had worked so hard to build. Desperation clawed at him. He had to find a way to stop Maya from getting too close to the truth before it was too late. Maya's investigation had become all-consuming. For days, she pored over files, made calls, and dug deeper into Governor Randall's connections. Every lead she followed seemed to confirm her suspicions. There was a dark web of corruption tied to a major pharmaceutical company, and Randall was at the center of it. Stephen, watching her obsess over the details, felt his anxiety deepen. He knew it was only a matter of time before Maya stumbled across the one piece of information that would expose his role in the cover-up. Each day, the noose around his neck tightened a little more. One evening, as Maya sat surrounded by papers and notes, Stephen approached her, his heart racing. "Maya, I think you need to be careful with this story," he said, his voice betraying his fear. "If you push too hard, you could get into serious trouble. These are powerful people." Maya looked up at him, her brow furrowed. "That's exactly why I have to keep going. The truth needs to come out, Stephen. I'm so close to breaking this wide open." Her words sent a wave of panic through him, but Stephen tried to remain composed. "I just don't want you to get hurt," he said softly, but Maya's attention was already back on her work. She pulled out a file and laid it in front of her. "Look at this," she said, her voice filled with excitement. "I found a link between Randall and a series of backroom deals with a pharmaceutical company. It looks like they were pushing for certain drugs to be approved without proper testing. And here's the kicker. They were using influence over doctors to manipulate diagnoses and treatments." Stephen's heart skipped a beat. He stared at the file, trying to keep his face neutral, but inside, he was unraveling. He knew exactly what she was talking about. It was the same company that had pressured him years ago to approve Randall's less aggressive treatment. The same company that had tied his hands and pushed him into a corner. Maya continued, oblivious to Stephen's growing fear. "If I can prove this, it's going to blow the whole thing wide open. Randall's just the tip of the iceberg." Stephen excused himself, retreating to his office where he could barely keep his thoughts straight. His past was crashing into his present, and Maya was unknowingly driving straight toward the truth that could destroy them both. He stared at the wall, knowing that once she connected all the dots, it would be too late for him to hide. The next day at the hospital, the tension between Stephen and Dr. Erin Graves reached a breaking point. Erin had always been perceptive, but now her interest in Randall's case bordered on obsession. Stephen could sense her hovering around every corner, watching, waiting for him to slip up. It didn't help that Governor Randall's condition had worsened. His recovery was slow, and every setback seemed to draw Erin closer to the truth that Stephen had been desperately trying to conceal. That afternoon, Stephen was reviewing Randall's charts in the ICU when Erin approached him, her expression unreadable. "Stephen, can we talk?" she asked, her voice calm but firm. Stephen's heart sank. He followed her into a small conference room, the door closing behind them with an ominous click. Erin didn't waste any time. "I've been looking into Randall's medical history," she said, her eyes never leaving his. "And something doesn't add up." Stephen swallowed hard, his palms sweating. "What do you mean?" "There are gaps in his treatment plan from a few years ago," Erin continued, her voice sharper now. "Decisions that don't make sense given his condition. And I know you were involved in those decisions." Stephen's throat tightened. He could feel the walls closing in around him. "I don't know what you're implying, Erin," he said, trying to maintain his composure. Erin crossed her arms, her gaze piercing. "I think you know exactly what I'm implying. There's more to this case than you're letting on, and I'm going to find out what it is. Unless, of course, you want to tell me yourself." Her words hung in the air like a noose, tightening with each passing second. Stephen's mind raced. He couldn't let her dig any further, but confessing would mean the end of everything he had built. His career, his reputation, even his marriage. all of it would be gone. "I did what I thought was best at the time," Stephen said, his voice shaking slightly. "There were external pressures." Aaron raised an eyebrow. "External pressures? You mean the pharmaceutical company that had ties to Randall?" Stephen's heart pounded in his chest. She knew, or at least, she was close enough to knowing the truth. He could deny it, try to cover his tracks, but Aaron wasn't the type to back down. She would keep digging until she exposed everything. "What do you want from me?" Stephen asked, his voice barely above a whisper. Aaron leaned in, her eyes cold. "I want the truth. Either you come clean, or I will. And trust me, Stephen, when I do, there will be no coming back from this." Stephen stood frozen, his mind spinning. He had always known this day might come, but now that it was here, he realized just how unprepared he was. Aaron's ultimatum left him with two choices: confess and lose everything, or try to stop her and risk being exposed anyway. The weight of the decision pressed down on him, crushing any sense of control he thought he had. There was no way out. No matter what he chose, the truth would eventually come to light. Stephen's hands trembled as he unlocked the door to his house that evening. The weight of Aaron's ultimatum had been crushing him all day, and now, as he walked into the quiet of his home, the realization that he could no longer keep the secret hit him harder than ever. The house was dimly lit, and he could hear the faint clatter of dishes from the kitchen where Maya was preparing dinner. His heart pounded as he approached her. He knew what he had to do. There was no way he could continue living this lie, especially not with Aaron breathing down his neck, ready to expose everything. But telling Maya, the one person who trusted him completely, would break her heart. He stood in the doorway, watching her move about the kitchen, her focus entirely on the meal in front of her. She looked so calm, so unaware of the storm that was about to hit. He took a deep breath. "Maya, we need to talk," he said, his voice barely above a whisper. Maya turned to face him, noticing the tension in his expression. "What is it? You look like you've seen a ghost." Stephen couldn't bring himself to speak immediately. His throat felt tight, his chest heavy. He hadn't even rehearsed how he would begin this conversation. How could you prepare for something like this? "Maya, there's something I need to tell you. Something I should have told you a long time ago." Maya's brow furrowed as she put down the dish she was holding, concern etched across her face. "What's going on, Stephen? You're scaring me." He swallowed hard, the words forming slowly in his mind. "It's about Governor Randall," he began. "There's something I haven't told you about him, about his medical history and my involvement." Maya's eyes widened slightly, her attention fully on him now. "Your involvement?" Stephen nodded, the shame washing over him in waves. "Years ago, when I was working on his case, I made a mistake, a huge mistake. I let the pharmaceutical company influence my decision on his treatment. I allowed them to push for a less aggressive plan because they didn't want to tarnish his public image, and I went along with it." Maya stared at him, her face a mask of shock. "You did what?" Stephen couldn't stop now. The words flowed out of him like a dam breaking. "I should have insisted on a more aggressive treatment, but I didn't. I let them convince me it wasn't necessary, and now, with everything happening to him, I know it's my fault. If I had pushed back, he wouldn't be in this condition. And if Aaron finds out, it's all over." Maya stepped back, her face pale. "Stephen, how could you? How could you let something like this happen?" "I didn't think it would go this far," he said, desperation creeping into his voice. "I thought it was just a one-time thing, a mistake that wouldn't have long-term consequences, but now..." Maya shook her head, disbelief clouding her eyes. "This is so much bigger than just a mistake, Stephen. You jeopardized someone's life. How many others have been affected by this?" Stephen could see the pain in her expression. The trust between them had been shattered, and it was his doing. "I never meant for it to go this far," he said, his voice breaking. "I just wanted to move past it, to fix things. But now Aaron is threatening to expose me, and if she does, it's over." Maya stood there, silent for what felt like an eternity. Stephen braced himself, waiting for the inevitable outburst, for her to scream or cry. But instead, she spoke with a quiet intensity that cut deeper than any scream ever could. "You have to come clean," she said, her voice steady but laced with pain. "You can't keep living like this, Stephen. You have to make it right." Stephen nodded, tears stinging the corners of his eyes. I know I do." Maya didn't say much after Stephen's confession. She had gone quiet, her thoughts clearly racing, as she tried to process everything. Stephen gave her space, knowing she needed time to come to terms with what he had told her. But that night, as he lay in bed, unable to sleep, he knew their relationship would never be the same. The next day at the hospital, Stephen tried to focus on his work, but his mind kept drifting back to his conversation with Maya. He couldn't stop thinking about the hurt in her eyes, the sense of betrayal she must have felt. He had broken her trust, and he wasn't sure if it could ever be repaired. As he made his rounds, he noticed Dr. Erin Graves watching him again, her sharp gaze following him through the corridors. She hadn't approached him yet, but Stephen could feel the weight of her suspicions growing heavier by the hour. She knew something, or at least, she suspected enough to be dangerous. Later that afternoon, as Stephen sat at his office, reviewing Governor Randall's latest test results, there was a knock on the door. Erin stepped in without waiting for an invitation. "We need to talk," she said, her tone leaving no room for argument. Stephen looked up, trying to keep his expression neutral. "What is it?" Erin closed the door behind her and walked over to his desk, her arms crossed. "I've been doing some digging. Randall's medical records from a few years ago don't match up with what should have been done for someone in his condition." Stephen's pulse quickened, but he forced himself to remain calm. "I don't know what you're talking about." "Oh, I think you do," Erin said, leaning forward slightly. "I think you made a choice back then that you regret now, and I think it's time you come clean about it." Stephen's hands tightened into fists under the desk. He had already confessed to Maya. He had told her everything, hoping it would be enough to start fixing things. But now Erin was pushing him to go public, to expose the full extent of what had happened. "I don't know what you expect me to say, Erin," Stephen said, his voice strained. "I expect you to tell the truth," Erin replied sharply. "Because if you don't, I will." Stephen stared at her, his mind racing. He couldn't afford to have Erin expose him. If she went public with this, it would destroy not only his career, but also his reputation, his life. Everything he had worked for would be gone. But before he could respond, Erin took a step back and folded her arms across her chest. "You have until the end of the week, Stephen. If you haven't told the hospital board by then, I'll do it myself." She turned and walked out, leaving Stephen sitting there, stunned. The ultimatum had been set, and now he had no choice. Erin had given him a deadline, and time was running out. The weight of Erin's ultimatum hung over Stephen like a dark cloud. He had only a few days to make a decision that would alter the course of his life forever. The hospital halls, usually a place where he found control and confidence, now felt like a prison. His every move felt scrutinized, every conversation a potential slip that could expose him. Governor Randall's condition had stabilized somewhat, but his recovery was slow. The pressure from the media and political world was building. Randall's health had become a topic of national debate, with reporters camped outside the hospital, eager for updates. As the doctor overseeing Randall's case, Stephen knew that once the truth came out, all eyes would turn toward him, and the fallout would be catastrophic. At home, things were no better. Maya had barely spoken to him since his confession. She went about her routine quietly, the once easy connection between them now fractured. Stephen could feel her disappointment and anger simmering beneath the surface. She had asked him to come clean, to make things right, but he hadn't yet decided how to do that. The following morning, Stephen stood in front of the hospital's glass entrance, staring out at the press gathered on the sidewalk. His hands were shaking again. He knew what he had to do. He had known for days, ever since Erin had given him the ultimatum. There was no way to stop the truth from coming out, and every day he waited made it worse. He could either tell the hospital board everything or wait for Erin to expose him. Both options led to the same outcome, but only one gave him a sense of control over the situation. By late afternoon, Stephen found himself outside the boardroom. The hospital administrators and board members gathered inside. He hesitated for a moment, his mind racing. Could he really throw away everything he had worked for? Could he survive the fallout from admitting his role in Randall's mistreatment? But the guilt had become too much. Maya's words echoed in his mind. You have to make it right. And maybe, just maybe, there was a sliver of redemption left for him if he chose to come forward. With a deep breath, Stephen opened the door and stepped into the boardroom. The eyes of the hospital administrators fell on him, their expressions curious and expectant. He was the head of cardiology, after all, the man responsible for saving one of the most important political figures in the country. But Stephen knew that after today, he wouldn't be seen as a hero. Thank you for meeting with me on such short notice, Stephen began, his voice steady, though his hands trembled at his sides. There's something I need to tell you, something that I've been hiding for far too long. The words spilled out of Stephen, each one heavier than the last. He explained how, years ago, he had allowed himself to be influenced by the pharmaceutical company pushing for a less aggressive treatment for Governor Randall. He admitted to succumbing to the pressure of political figures who didn't want Randall's health issues made public. And worst of all, he confessed to knowingly approving a treatment plan that was insufficient, one that had ultimately led to the governor's current condition. The silence in the boardroom was deafening as Stephen finished his confession. The hospital administrators looked at him with a mixture of shock, disbelief, and anger. Some shifted uncomfortably in their seats, while others exchanged glances, as if waiting for someone to speak first. Finally, the head of the hospital's board, Dr. Simmons, leaned forward, his expression grim. Do you realize the magnitude of what you're admitting, Dr. Hart? This could destroy your career. It could ruin the hospital's reputation. I know, Stephen said quietly, but it's the truth, and I'm ready to face the consequences. Dr. Simmons stared at him for a long moment before nodding. We'll need to conduct a full investigation, of course. But for now, I think it's best if you step down from your position. Stephen nodded, the weight of the decision settling over him like a heavy cloak. It was done. The truth was out, and there was no going back. He had confessed not only to the board, but to himself. He had spent years trying to bury the guilt, trying to outrun the consequences of his choices, but now they were catching up with him. As he left the boardroom, his steps felt lighter, even though the future was uncertain. He knew he had done the right thing, but that didn't mean the road ahead would be easy. His career was likely over, and his reputation, once sterling, was now irreparably tarnished. Outside the hospital, the media frenzy had intensified. Reporters crowded the entrance, their cameras flashing, and microphones thrust toward him as he stepped outside. Stephen ignored them, walking past the crowd in silence. He had nothing more to say. The world would know the truth soon enough. That evening, when he returned home, Maya was waiting for him in the living room. She stood when she saw him, her expression unreadable. I did it, Stephen said, his voice hoarse. I told the board everything. Maya's eyes softened, and she stepped closer to him. And what happens now? I don't know, Stephen admitted. I'll probably lose my medical license. I've already stepped down from my position at the hospital. But I had to come clean. I couldn't keep hiding anymore. For a moment, they stood in silence, the weight of everything that had happened between them hanging in the air. Then, to Stephen's surprise, Maya reached out and took his hand. You did the right thing, she said softly. It doesn't fix everything, but it's a start. Stephen felt tears sting his eyes as he squeezed her hand. I'm so sorry, Maya, for everything. I know, she whispered, but we'll get through this, together. As they stood there, the future uncertain, but the truth finally out in the open, Stephen felt a small glimmer of hope. He had lost so much, his career, his reputation, but perhaps, in facing his mistakes, he had found a path to redemption. Hey, if you enjoyed this story and want to see more like it, don't forget to subscribe to the channel and leave a like. Your support really helps us grow and keeps us motivated to bring you more engaging content. We'd love to hear from you. What part of the Guild of a Doctor had the most impact on you? Was it the internal conflict, the big reveal, Or maybe something else? Let us know in the comments. And while you're there, feel free to drop suggestions for new stories you'd like to see on the channel. We're always looking for fresh ideas, and your input is super valuable to us. Thanks for being a part of this journey, and we can't wait to hear your thoughts.